Welcome to today's webinar, the new ASTM Phase I standard, the nuts and bolts, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning, the second in a series of 3 programs that are part of a series we are calling From Due Diligence to Redevelopment. My name is Jason Dubo, and I'm the manager for the Resource Conservation and Management Unit within the Maryland Department of Planning. In this series, we will explore how Maryland's brownfields provide a unique opportunity for communities to meet economic development goals, environmental protection and sustainability goals, and to help achieve local comprehensive plan visions and objectives. Maryland's brownfields can also be assets for revitalization, reinvestment, and redevelopment. This webinar series will provide opportunities to learn the essential environmental and statutory requirements for brownfield property transactions from regulatory, legal, and consultant experts, as well as assistance and know-how for redeveloping brownfields from federal, state, and real estate development specialists. This webinar is one of many produced by the Maryland Department of Planning. The department also produces webinars on behalf of the Smart Growth Network on smart growth and planning topics and is available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and we will be posting it on our website. We encourage you to visit our website and to visit smartgrowth.org, where you can subscribe to our email list to learn about our upcoming webinars. The views expressed by the speakers in this webinar are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is the new ASTM Phase I ESA standard, the nuts and bolts. You can also search for event number 924-9796. Our speakers today are Chemmie, Sokolic, and Denise Sullivan, and our moderator is Sue Boyle. Chemmie Sokolic is the founder and principal of the Falcon Real Estate Group. He has over 21 years of experience in the environmental due diligence field, specializing in large and complex environmental site assessments, or ESAs, for all types of industrial and commercial facilities throughout the U.S., as well as preliminary assessment reports, or PARs, in New Jersey. He has conducted well over 1,000 Phase I ESAs, PARs, environmental inspections, and/or due diligence projects at a wide variety of sites. Chemmie is also a member of the ASTM Committee E50 on Environmental Assessment, Risk Management, and Corrective Action, including the E1527 Phase I Task Group. Denise Sullivan is the principal and founder of Urban Green Environmental and a certified professional engineer. Denise founded the company in 2007 as a Baltimore-based environmental consulting firm focused on environmental investigations and remediation of urban infill properties and brownfields. The Urban Green mission is to investigate properties for environmental liabilities and provide solutions to those liabilities. Sue Boyle, our moderator, is a senior consultant at GEI Consultants Incorporated and is known for her leadership of the New Jersey Licensed Site Remediation Professionals Association, the LSRPA, the Brownfield Coalition of the Northeast, BCON, and the New York City Brownfield Partnership. Sue is a former Assistant Commissioner of Site Remediation at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and a national thought leader in brownfield remediation and redevelopment. Following their presentations, our panelists will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question at any time by using the questions tool located in the control panel on the right side of your screen. First, before the presentations, we will take some quick polls to get started. And if you are unable to respond to the polls by clicking, please leave the full screen mode. So our first poll is, where do you live or work? Either are you in Maryland? Are you in the Mid-Atlantic, but not in Maryland? Are you in the United States, outside of the Mid-Atlantic, or are you outside of the United States? Let's take some time to respond to the poll. We're waiting a couple more seconds for you to respond to the poll. And our answers are that 32% of you attending today are in Maryland, 20% are in the Mid-Atlantic outside of Maryland, 44% are in the United States outside of the Mid-Atlantic, and 4% are outside of the United States. So welcome everybody, it's great to see that. For our second poll question, please let us know how you would best describe your profession. Please select one of the following. Are you an attorney? Are you working as a consultant or scientist or engineer? Are you working as an investor, developer, landowner, or purchaser? Are you working as a lender or other? So let's take a few moments to respond to the poll. Thank you. And we'll take a few more seconds to have you respond to the poll. All right, and look at our responses here. We have 4% of you are attorneys. The vast majority, 54%, are consultants, scientists, or engineers. 6% identify as investors, developers, landowners, or purchasers. No one apparently today attending are lenders, but 36% list your profession as other. Thank you. And we have one last poll for you today to help get to know our audience. So please let us know how familiar you are with a Phase I environmental site assessment. Let us know if you're very familiar, somewhat familiar, or not familiar with a Phase I ESA. Let's take a few moments to please respond to the poll. Take a couple more seconds. All right, so 43% of you are very familiar with Phase I, 39% are somewhat familiar, and 17% are not familiar. So we really appreciate you filling out the poll. It will help our presenters as they move forward with their presentations today. So, and with that, I'll turn it over to our first speaker, Denise Sullivan. Welcome, Denise.
Jason, thank you. And I am hopefully now showing my screen. And I'm very happy to see the poll results that we have a nice variety of folks both familiar with Phase Is as well as new to Phase I. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Jason, Sylvia, and the Maryland Department of Planning for including me in this second part of your Brownfields webinar series, the new ASTM Phase I standard, the nuts and bolts. To start things off today, we thought that it would be helpful to provide a brief history of the creation, purpose, and changes to the ASTM Phase I standard from when it was created in 1993 through the current standard 2013, and then of course Chemmie will go through the changes of 21, sorry. So as such, I'm going to take you through a brief history of environmental laws and regulations, the creation of the 1993 standard, which is also the very first year that I worked as an intern in this industry. I don't know if that's near and dear to my heart, but it's there. An overview of the Phase I process and the revisions to the standard that have been published in 1994, 1997, 2000, and then 2005 and 2013. So here on this slide, we have a selection of environmental laws, regulations, starting with the Clean Air Act in 1970 and through the Brownfield Revitalization Act in 2002. And sort of as smaller bullets within, you can see that the ASTM E1527 committee was established in 1990. And then the first published standard was in 1993, and then the subsequent revisions. And then highlighted here, I have the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act and the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act and Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. And the reason they're highlighted is these are considered companion statutes and primary drivers behind the growth of the environmental assessment and due diligence industry, where we have, and I'm going to just quickly go through the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. I like to say it's one of my favorite laws. I'm not an attorney, but it is. It is the proactive management of environmental pollution and basically gives EPA the authority to control hazardous waste from origination all the way through disposal, something that we often call cradle to grave. So where it's documenting the proper documentation process and basically managing that entire process. And RCRA typically focuses on active and future facilities and does not address abandoned or historical sites. Whereas CERCLA and SARA is retroactive with respects to environmental pollution. CERCLA, or the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, and the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act come into play. CERCLA and SARA impose liability on parties who, in whole or in part, the presence of a hazardous substance at a site, they may be considered responsible. And liability can be triggered under various conditions. And for anyone who has been involved, even tangentially, with a CERCLA or NPL investigation or remediation, and I have one right now where there is consideration for a site, and it doesn't matter how many decades, it still can wreak a bit of havoc. But this can be a complicated and lengthy process that can stall or cripple a real estate transaction, a redevelopment, or even a refinancing. And these two sort of were those triggers for the environmental due diligence industry. So within CERCLA, many of us have heard the terms, and if you haven't, the term innocent landowner defense in all appropriate inquiry, which essentially identifies that if a party performs all appropriate inquiry, they could then qualify for the innocent landowner defense and would not be subject to this CERCLA liability. And as such, the ASTM standard practice was created, and this was in 1993. In summary, to define good commercial and customary standards and practices for conducting all appropriate inquiries to satisfy the innocent landowner defense. And we would do that by investigating a property by non-intrusive means and evaluate a release or potential release of hazardous materials or petroleum products to the environment. And what does this mean? So what I can tell you is that in 1993, when I started my career, an environmental site assessment meant something different to anyone you asked. It could be a 2-page document with a drive-by survey or a lengthy report with in-depth regulatory case file reviews. Pet peeve of mine, it might include a figure, which I think it always should, but it might not, particularly back then. It may or may not include opinions, and they were all different. And the 1993 ASTM standard was intended to change that and provide standardization, at least we hoped, with minimum expectations for Phase I environmental site assessments. And there are 5 key elements of that Phase I environmental site assessment. So we have the site inspection, historical records review, regulatory records review, interviews, and then report preparation. So to take a bit of a deeper dive, and I shouldn't even say deeper dive, to take a very shallow wade into the pool of a site visit, here's an abbreviated list of what we tend to look for in a site visit, all with the intent to identify current historic areas of chemical use, handling, generation, or disposal at a property, sensitive receptors, receptors in general, possible areas of migration. I'm often going into abandoned buildings and through a property, looking for clues of historical uses. These are things that I look for that are listed here. An interesting, I'm going to say, staple of my inspections is to always review an electrical panel. I actually can't tell you how many storage tanks I've identified excuse me, over the past several decades based solely on a panel descriptor of a gas pump or a fuel pump. And while my age does not endear me to Google, often in my office, we are sending around photos of manhole covers or unknown conduits, and searching them online to identify what they could be used for. I do apologize. I am right now moving through COVID. Okay, so site visit would be one piece, and then historical records. We typically have the big 4 that we see: Sanborn historical fire insurance atlases, maps, city directories, aerial photographs, topographic maps, local records, which could be, depending upon where you are in the country, town, city, county, or all, state and federal records, and interviews with hopefully someone that would be knowledgeable about the property. And in all of this, I would note that the biggest change that I've experienced since I started preparing what I would consider to be a reputable Phase I environmental site assessment in 1994. Note, not 1993 when I started, is in the report generation and preparation. The second firm that I worked at was also a Boston-based firm. And back in 1994, we were pulling Sanborn historical atlases, topos, aerials, and city directories for every property we were doing a Phase I. We were going to local municipal offices for building permit records, storage tank records, wells, septic, discharge permits. We were reviewing case files at the DEP and the EPA with standing DEP appointments on an almost weekly basis. And this was in 1994 for then a $2,000 Phase I that, if I recall correctly, on average, I would spend the better part of a week on a report. And when the database and resource providers first came out with their products and clients were requesting that we use them for consistency, I can't tell you the number of times I was actually reaching out to them to ask if they could update some of their databases, for I had more accurate information in my own personal repository, just based on the firm that I was working for and their standard of care that we were required to adhere to. It's quite different today. I don't know if I would say it's just quite different today, where I would say the database and resource providers have far more robust information, and local and state information in many cases has either been archived or even destroyed and is not available like it was maybe 30 years ago. But all of this to say that while the standard has changed over time, the process has remained mostly consistent, even with each revision in the Phase I standard. And here is just an example of some high-level revisions from 94, 97, and 2000. These are separated out because all of these predate the passing of the Brownfields Revitalization Act in 2002. Revisions included modifications regarding data record searches, historical reviews, new definitions, which it's important to always have new definitions, activity and use limitations, historical recognized environmental conditions, and then opinions. And then following the signing of that 2002 Brownfield Revitalization Act, the ASTM and the EPA worked together to ensure that the ASTM revisions did not conflict with all appropriate inquiry, and that the Phase I performed in accordance with the standard and in concert with user responsibilities could constitute all appropriate inquiry. So what we had were revisions in 2005 and 2013, some of which I thought were long overdue, including requirements for who could perform and oversee a Phase I environmental site assessment, that environmental professional. Other revisions, including minimum requirements for agency and historical reviews, identification of data gaps, vapor migration, and new and updated definitions for recognized environmental conditions, historic recognized environmental conditions, and controlled recognized environmental conditions, and then findings and conclusions sections updates. And towards that end, I would like to introduce Chemmie, who will now provide a summary of the primary changes to look for in the new ASTM 1527-21 Phase I Environmental Site Assessment Standard.
Thank you, Denise. Appreciate that. You guys should all be able to see my screen now. If not,
Yeah, could you please get it into a slideshow so we don't see all of your desktop and stuff?
I did. I apologize. Resume slideshow.
Change your screen. Yeah, you're going to have to change your monitor. Go to sharing and select your monitor that your slideshow is on by using the drop down.
Is that the correct one?
Nope. Select the screen. There you go.
Okay. All right. We good? All right. So let's just say I'm way better at Phase I's than I am with technology when it comes to all the different platforms that we've all been learning about the last couple of years during COVID. So welcome, everyone. It's nice to be here. Thank you, Denise, for that really robust and although brief but robust introduction to Phase I's over the years. I'm going to pick up where Denise left off. You should be able to see my second slide now. This slide basically...
Nope, please advance your slide on the screen that is active.
Better? Okay.
That's
all
right.
So this slide basically is a summary of what Denise just went through. I'm not going to discuss that, but just to overlap where she handed off, this is where I'm going to be picking up. So these are all the revisions that have been happening over the last couple of decades or so, and so where are we at now? Now we've just come out with a 2021 standard. So let's talk about that and how it relates to the previous standard, the now historical standard, 2013 standard. I, as was introduced as being on the task group responsible for putting together the new 2021 standard. The reasons we were doing that is because ASTM standards have an 8-year shelf life. At the end of those 8 years, one of three things has to happen. Either the sunset, we just let no action happens and the standard just sunsets, or we ballot and we reapprove the same standard with no changes, or as in the case with this current standard, we reconvene the whole task group and we review the current standard and see what revisions are necessary. And that's exactly what we did this go around. So I think it's important to repeat what Denise said, just to underline the fact that why are we doing this? Why are we looking at these standards? Why are we changing the standards? The whole point of a phase one is to clarify what good commercial and customary standards and practices are with regards to doing environmental due diligence for the purposes of AAI, all appropriate inquiries. Where we see, for example, that over time, different consultants are doing things differently, sometimes things need to be clarified. No, this is the industry standard. This is how, this is the vast majority of people are doing it this way. The clients want it this way. This is the best practices across the industry, and to clarify that. And in addition, litigation and insurance claims also highlight some of the ways that maybe the text wasn't clear, or maybe some consultants are doing it, didn't fully understand what the rationale is for some of the things in the standard. So it's a really good thing. It's good practice to go back and review how the phase one should, what it should contain and how those things should be phrased. So how did we do that? Well, the task group started officially in 2018. The task group is a group of around 250 people, maybe more, maybe less over time. And it's comprised of both users, producers, and interested parties. So users are people such as investors, such as purchasers, people who are using, entities that are using the phase one to get the information that they need. Producers are the consultants, essentially, who are preparing those reports. And interested parties could be, for example, attorneys and other people who are, also use the phase one in some way, shape, or form. Again, the objectives were to clarify and improve the existing language, to update the current customary practice, and really to strengthen the deliverable. There were so many meetings that we've had, over 75 full task group meetings with everyone. Obviously, there was quite a few people on those calls, but in addition to that, the task group was split into focus groups. And each of those focus groups could be anywhere between 5, 10, 15, 20 people maybe, each focusing on a certain part of the standard to review, to discuss, to revise, to consider. And those were hundreds, and I attended most of those meetings. I was in pretty much all of the focus groups, and there were probably hundreds of meetings. It was sometimes several a week for 4 years. So it was really a very intense, but quite enjoyable process. And as the last bullet indicates, the standard was balloted for the entire task group several times before it resulted in what we have now today. And here it is. This is the brand new ASTM E1527-21 standard. So it was actually quite interesting. I'm really glad we ran those polls at the beginning of the presentation today, because it seems like we really do have a very interesting mix of people. We have people who are not familiar with the phase one at all, people who are somewhat familiar, and people who are totally familiar with the phase one. So what we're going to hope to do in this presentation is really try to give everyone a taste of what's been going on, give some details, but not go into too much detail to bore the tears out of people who aren't perhaps so familiar with phase one. So we're going to be talking about all these things. We're going to be talking about the revised definitions, guidance language, historical research, the report content, and then the appendices. Some of these things I'll be breezing over a little bit quicker than others, and some things I'll be drilling down to more detail. So just to remind everyone of Phase I, ostensibly there are 4 buckets of conditions that an environmental professional reviews and offers an opinion regarding the importance regarding a release to the site. So the primary condition that one looks at is recognized environmental condition, the presence or likely presence of release to the environment. In addition to that, there's a historical recognized environmental condition. Ostensibly what that is there used to be a wreck at the site, but it was cleaned up. There was a release, but it was cleaned up, and it was remediated to an unrestricted use, which means that the site's back to how it was, or perhaps even cleaner than it used to be before. So HRECs are not wrecks. They used to be wrecks, and now they are no longer wrecks. Controlled recognized environmental conditions, again, those are wrecks, and they still are wrecks because there may have been some remediation at the site, or not, but there's a condition at the site that restricts the use of the site. So perhaps, for example, it's remediated, but only to a commercial standard, not a residential standard. Maybe there's a cap over the site, and so that's been remediated, but not necessarily to unrestricted use. So that would be a controlled wreck. And controlled wrecks, by definition, are wrecks, right? There's still contamination at the site, so there's still a wreck there. And then you have the 4th bucket, de minimis condition, which I'll talk a little bit about later. We really took a look at all these definitions in the new standard, and I'm going to be talking about some of the changes that have been made. One thing I can recommend you all do is there is a brand new appendix in this Phase I standard now. It's like a logic, like a flow chart, a diagram to help consultants and others really understand what is a REC, what is an HREC, what is a CREC, what is the de minimis condition. In addition to that flow diagram, there's also really handy examples. Those examples are just that, just examples. They're not meant to be all-inclusive. They're just basic examples to indicate, to give an example of the thought process behind determining whether something is a REC, an HREC, a CREC, or de minimis condition. So I highly suggest you take a look at that. So let's look at the revised REC definition. I'm not going to read through all this text. You're going to get copies of these slides. But what's important to note is the terms, the likely presence of hazardous substances or petroleum products in, on, or at the subject property due to a release or likely release to the environment. So there's basically 3 different triggers that you could have a REC. Either you know about the stuff that's in the, you know that it's contaminated, or you don't know 100%, but it's likely, there's a likely presence that something is in the environment, or that there is something that poses a material threat of a future release to the environment. So the only thing I'd point out in this slide is the double use of the word likely in point number 2 at the bottom. That was intentional by the task group, and maybe when we get to the questions at the end, we can talk about exactly why that is. But moving on now, so revised definition, this I'm just going to skim over. That definition of release, just to clarify that some releases are not releases under circular, for example, the normal application of fertilizer. And new likely definition. So I already mentioned the word likely. There's a reason definition is in quotation marks, because it's not really a definition per se. It's more like a discussion point, a note in the new standard. But it is definitely something that is not in the 2013 standard. So, the word likely is in there, but there's really no clarification. What is likely? What is a likely presence of hazardous materials? Likely to one person could be 51%, right? Or likely could be 91%, or 65%, or more likely than not. Or there's actually dozens of different ways that you can define likely. So we task group thought it would be very helpful to actually describe what, for the purposes of the standard, what likely is. Likely is that which is neither certain nor proved, but can be expected or believed by a reasonable observer based on the logic and/or experience of the environmental professional, or the available evidence, as stated in the report. So the important thing here is that if the EP, if the environmental professional, that's the consultant who's doing the report, preparing the report, if they think that something is a wreck, that's fine, right? They can say that, but they've got to say why. You've got to get, what's your evidence? And similarly, what's your evidence for not being a wreck? If you have something that may be a wreck, but then at the end of the day, the EP thinks it's not a wreck, the environmental professional has to state in their opinion why they think that's the case. So material threat, I'm not going to go into the details here because this is already included in the historical 2013 standard. Just some of the changes that you'll see. The term physically observable was deleted. And really the rationale behind that was because underground storage tanks, which by definition are underground and may not be physically observable, could be a material threat of a release. And so that was the rationale behind that slight tweak. And the same thing here with an obvious, that which is plain or evident, a condition of that or fact that could not be ignored or overlooked by a reasonable observer. So taking a look at the CREC definition, again, lots of text here, and certainly you can feel free to read through the details of the slide. The change that I want to just focus on for the purposes of this conversation is, and just to remind everyone on the call, for those not familiar with what a CREC definition, what a CREC is, it's ostensibly impact contamination that is in the ground and that is controlled in some way. Maybe there's a cap, maybe there's a deed notice, or something else. And the something else is really the key to the change in the CREC definition in the 2021 standard. So before it was the pertinent part of the CREC definition was products allowed to remain in place subject to the implementation of required controls, for example, property use restrictions, activity and use limitations, institutional controls, or engineering controls. The change that we made in the new standard is activity and use limitations or other property use limitations. So property use limitations is the key change that was made. It was a definition, it was a concept that really needed to be clarified in the new standard. And the definition you can see here is limitation or restriction on current or future use of a property in connection with a response to a release. So it's not necessarily a cap or a deed notice. It doesn't necessarily have to be a legal instrument per se, such as a deed notice. Again, the details of that, I'm sure there'll be questions at the end, and we can, depending on the details, depending on the questions, sorry, we can drill down into what exactly that means. And finally, the fourth bucket, de minimis condition. Again, well, this hasn't really changed since the 2013 standard, but I think it's important to note. So the change that was made was reiterating and clarifying is that the condition, basically to paraphrase what a de minimis condition is, it's basically a small amount of contamination or release that, if brought to the attention of an enforcement government agency, and that it wouldn't be an issue, that there's no present threat to the human health and the environment. It's, in other words, it's maybe it's a little bit of a release in the parking lot or something like that from a car or something like that. The only change that we made here is that we added the words related to a release. Now that is true in the 2013 standard as well, but we needed to clarify that de minimis condition was related to a release. Now there has been some talk I've heard some attorneys, for example, who have said, well, if the government agency isn't going to do anything about it because maybe I'm not going to be using the groundwater anyways, so therefore that something could be a de minimis condition, when in fact it probably is a wreck. That is something that I'm clarifying here, is that you really do need both of these conditions. Not only does it not be subject to an enforcement action if brought to the attention of the appropriate government agency, but it also should not present a threat to human health and the environment, regardless of what the government agency is saying. So you do need those two things. But again, a de minimis condition is not a REC, nor is it a CREC. This I'm just going to skim over. We did revise the standard to clarify and to give some more helpful information to producers, consultants about land title records, where one gets those, what title searches to perform, what to look for. So just providing this for your, you can go to the details and look at the standard just to indicate that that was helpful there. And again, another revised definition for visually and or physically observed. Same idea, right? Is that we're trying to just clarify what we mean when we're talking about visually and or physically observed. You could smell something, right? So smelling something, if you smell a release, for example, of petroleum, that you've observed it, quote unquote. So it's not just about what you see with your eyes, it's what you hear, it's what you can smell. There's a number of ways that a consultant can pick something up when they do their site inspection. Emerging contaminants is as the name implies, emerging as a concern. Some of the big ones that have been flying, PFAS is certainly something that people have been talking about for a number of years now, and certainly in the last couple of years more and more. PFAS is not currently regulated as a hazardous substance by the EPA under CERCLA. So to be clear about this, what does that mean? Is PFAS included in a phase one? And the simple answer is no, not now, not currently, because until the CERCLA lists PFAS as a hazardous substance, the phase one is meant to look for hazardous substances and petroleum products, but hazardous substances under the CERCLA table 302.4. So if it's not in that table, then it's simply not part of a phase one. Now, having said that, does that mean that these things aren't a concern? Does that mean that anything not included in this list is not a concern? Absolutely no, not at all. I mean, maybe it's a big concern. It's just not part of a phase one. Now, so what does that mean, right? What does that, if it's not part of a phase one, where does that leave people? So number one, if you are concerned about PFAS, there's other emerging contaminants, indeed anything that isn't included under the purview of a phase one, like wetlands or radon or asbestos. If you're concerned about that, certainly ask your consultant to include it, but it would be a non-scope item, right? It's a non-scope phase one item. Certainly these things are definitely something that people should be concerned about depending on the site. In addition, when the EPA does update their list, and they are looking at this now, and they do include PFAS in that list, automatically it's going to be part of a phase one. So when that happens, PFAS will automatically be part of under the purview of a phase one. Okay, so let's move on. Now, I'm going to start talking about the records review here. And I'm going to start not by talking about the change in the 2021 standard, but I'm actually going to be talking about the 2013 standard for a particular reason. So when the new 2013 standard came out, there were definitely some inclusions that weren't necessarily part of the previous 2005 standard. Some examples of that was the vapor migration. Vapor migration being gases in the subsurface that can move and potentially go from either from an adjoining property to the site, or from the site maybe into vapor intrusion into a building. So the notion of migration was added in the 2013 standard. Also what was added was the idea that one had to take a deeper look at the adjoining properties. So if an adjoining property was listed on a standard regulatory database, then further work needed to be done there. Yeah, if the adjoining property was listed on a database, is there a chance that my subject property has been impacted? And that was included in the 2013 standard. Now, the truth of the matter is that the majority of the consultants, the EPs out there were already thinking about this stuff in 2013. They were, I've been doing, but worrying about both of these things, obviously for many years, way before the 2013 standard came out. So when these changes came out, several consultants were saying, oh my goodness, now we need to look at this stuff. It's going to add time. It's going to add expense to the phase one. And other consultants were saying, well, I've been doing this already. So there was this conversation in the industry between consultants who are saying, oh my goodness, things are going to change, versus consultants who are saying, what do you mean things are going to change? You probably should have been doing all of this stuff anyways. So remember, the purpose of the new standard is to, again, talk about what is customary practice. What are people in the industry, what are the bulk of people doing? So with that backdrop, now let's talk about the 2013 standard revisions, and specifically regarding record reviews. So the first thing to note is if you're looking at the red line of the new standard, there's a lot of stuff that that changed, but only changed because it was really moved around or reordered. There's not as much change in there as you would immediately see when you first open up that red line. Another key change that was made, and I think this is really key, is that we clarified the objective of this section, of section 8.3. And that is that it's about recognized environmental conditions. It's not necessarily about the basic historical chronology. So in other words, I've seen reports in the past where consultants really talk about what went on at the site back to the Paleolithic age, the Jurassic age. There were dinosaurs on this site, and going back all the way. Really, I mean, the site history is interesting and it's important, but really the only reason we want to look at the site history is because we're looking at RECs. We're trying to find RECs, C-RECs, H-RECs, de minimis, these types of things where the whole point is to look at RECs. And that was true before as well, but that just helped clarify the purpose of this section. And all the other changes subsequent to that really come back to that objective of this section. So some of the highlights of the changes to this section, and by the way, one of the reasons I'm sort of talking a lot about this section, and will be for the next few slides, is that if I had to pick the two biggest discussion points at the task group, things that really brought out the most conversation amongst all the task group, number one was the C-REC definition, which I've already spoken about. And number two was the historical review, because it's really the historical review that many consultants, let's just say, do skim more than they maybe should do. So the historical review section was something that took a lot of effort to revise, to clarify, and I'm going to be talking about the details now. So one of the things that we did to clear up, to clarify what needs to be done, is we separated out the subject property from the adjoining properties from the surrounding area. The 2013 standard talks about the subject property, and then it groups adjoining and nearby and surrounding areas just all into this one type of group. And really, that's not best practice. That's not the industry standard. It's not customary practice. Really, what obviously the subject property is going to be, you're going to be doing a deep dive there. But the adjoining properties also need a level of detail that is going to be more than perhaps a site quite further away, because it's the nearby properties, the adjoining properties, which are going to have the most impact, or the most chance, to impact the subject property versus a site which is quite far away. So there's definitely levels of effort that's needed, and that was clarified in the new standard. So what are the other changes that were made? So type of use was clarified. When we're talking about the type of use, you need to define the type of use. Before, it was just industrial and manufacturing. And now retail was added to that list. So you need to really define what type of industrial, what type of manufacturing, and what type of retail. So, you could think, retail, what's retail? Why is retail there? Am I really too concerned about, I don't know, a bakery or a toy store or something like that? Well, really, the primary reason why retail was added was because of dry cleaners. the number one source of new Superfund sites right now are dry cleaners. Sit on that for just a minute. Dry cleaners are, there was some surveys that were done over the last few years, and it was determined that roughly 80 or 85% of dry cleaners are impacted. So to say that every dry cleaner is, there's obviously some nuance, but when you're talking about the term likely impacted, and you have a fact that the number one source of Superfund sites now are dry cleaners, and the majority of them are impacted, something to think about. And the industry the task group recognized that, so we added retail to the list. Specific information about uses is more helpful than general information. What do we mean here? Well, a consultant that writes in their report, there was a commercial building there from 1950 to the present. That is not very helpful. What was the commercial building used for? What type of operations? Who were the operators? What did they do there? You can't just say there was a building there. That's definitely, we need a little bit more information. So more information is better than less. Another change that, again, all these clarifications of what was already true is the nature of properties change. I mean, anyone involved in the real estate industry knows that, but it's important to recognize the fact that your site, the site boundary, well, that doesn't change. You go back in time, and whatever that boundary is today, well, that boundary is what you're looking at as far as the subject property. But that subject property could have been part of a larger property. So maybe information about the subject property is listed under what could be an adjoining property now. That happened to me, actually, just a few months ago. There was the lots and the blocks changed, and the definitions of what was the adjoining properties changed. So what is now the adjoining property actually used to be part of the subject property only a few decades ago, I think in the 90s in this particular example. So it's important to note what is the subject property, what are the adjoining properties both now and historically, and of course the surrounding properties. So source versus resource, this is just a note. We added, there's a difference between source, a historical source, and a historical resource. So a historical resource is a map, an aerial photograph, for example, a city directory. A source is where one gets the resource from. So for example, you could get city directories from a library. In this instance, the city directories are the resource, the library is the source. And so just to clarify that in the standard, it was helpful. Finally, the last bullet here is talking about the standard historical resources. And what we did is that we switched out one of the resources and we added in interviews. And that's because interviews are really important. It's another instance where some consultants don't push enough to get information with regards to interviews. Maybe they just, they send someone an email, or they're not really following up with as many people as they want. You really need to, a lot of good information can come from interviews, especially in some of the more rural areas where maybe there aren't certain historical resources. Interviews are really, really key. So definitely something which is worthy of being listed in the standard historical resource list. So the notion of the big four is something that came up. Denise actually also mentioned this. What are most consultants doing? What have they been doing over the last few years, especially with the proliferation of historical database package companies that are out there, who are making it easy to obtain these historical resources. And what the task group determined is that it is really now the industry standard that these 4 historical resources are generally being obtained by consultants. And those are aerial photographs, fire insurance maps, local street directories, and historical topographic maps. And really the default should be that all consultants, all sites are looking at these 4. However, I should point out that doesn't mean that in every single instance you do have to look at these 4. Sometimes, for example, it makes no sense to look at some of these 4. Let's say you're doing a phase 1 in the middle of Manhattan, for example, and your parcel is like a few hundred square feet parcel in the middle of Manhattan. Aerial photographs may not give you much in the way of information. So maybe there's a reason why you're not looking at a particular resource. But if you don't use one of these resources, you do have to indicate why that's the case in the report. Then, in addition to that, whatever of these big 4 that you looked at for the subject property, you also do need to look at it for the adjoining properties as well. Again, the same off-ramp goes that if you decide not to, that's okay, but you do need to say why. There has to be a justification for why the environmental professional chose not to do that, that review. So why? Why the clarification? Well, one of the things, the key words that we deleted in the 2021 standard is a very, very small word, 4 letters only. And what I'm referring to is in the 2013 standard, there is some language there that talks about the historical research review as being done only to the extent that it's being done for the subject property, and only to the extent some consultants, it turned out, were understanding that to be a limiting factor. So I don't need to do a historical resource review of this or of that. And that really wasn't the intent of using that word. And so that was clarified and that was deleted. So again, the purpose is, why were these changes made? And really it's to reduce the number of low quality phase 1s that are out there. As I said, the historical section is often the section where time and resources are cut and things are missed, recs are missed. I've seen it hundreds of times at this point, and it's not a good thing. And so what we're trying to do is not so much raise the bar, but to clarify where the bar already is across the industry, and to hopefully ensure that all EPs adhere to good commercial and custom-made practice. And so the question is, will it add time and cost, right? Are these changes, particularly the historical section, but any of the sections, are these going to increase the time and cost of a phase 1? And I'll say the same thing to you now as I said about the 2013 standard, and that is, well, it depends. If your EP was already doing this, then probably it's not going to change what they're doing. It's probably not going to add too much time and cost to their scope and to their phase 1s. But maybe for some other consultants who weren't doing this, well, now they do have to do it. And so maybe it will add time and cost to theirs. So really, it depends. So moving on, what are some other changes in the standard? So shelf life. Really, this didn't change. There is a shelf life to a phase 1. What we did here was to clarify some of the language that the clock, as it were, the 180-day shelf life begins to run, and it really isn't begins to run, it sort of goes back from, but it begins to run the first date of the following parts, right? The interviews, the review of government records, review of environmental liens, visual inspection of the property, or the declaration by the environmental professional. So whichever one is the first of these, that's the date that you can look back and say, okay, well, as long as this first thing is within 180 days of the transaction, then we're good. But if it falls out of that, then that part and any other part that falls out of the 180 days is going to be needed to be redone between 6 and 12 months. After 12 months, the whole phase 1 report would need to be redone. And the reason, the thing just to clarify here is that oftentimes, I think a lot of people recognize that there was a 180-day shelf life on a phase 1, but what they did is they looked at the date of the report, the date of the issuance of the report, and they said, okay, well, as long as that date is within 180 days of the transaction, we're good. But that is not the case. And that wasn't the case in 2013 either, for that matter. And so what we've clarified in the 2021 standard is that, no, it's not the date of issuance, it's the first of any of these. It's all these things, these 5 things need to be done within those 5 within those 180 days. And so it's good practice. I mean, I've been doing it for years, and certainly I encourage everyone else to do it, certainly now, is to list for each of these 5 things what date these were done. When was the site inspection performed? When was the review of environmental needs? The review of government records? Put the date in the report so that's easy to see. Okay, photos and figures. So interestingly, you know, Denise said that figures should be in the phase 1, and from the very early days, from the 90s, yeah, most consultants did put figures in the reports. Maybe some did, maybe some didn't. Same thing with photo logs. Well, interestingly enough, even as recently as the 2013 standard, there actually was no need, there was no requirement to prepare photo logs and figures. That's changed now. In the 2021 standard, again, everyone's already been doing this for ages, but it's just clarified that now one does need to include photos and figures. Significant data gaps. So significant data gaps, the essence of a significant data gap was true in the 2013 standard as well, but it really wasn't defined. It wasn't a definition. And so what we've done is we've defined a significant data gap in the report. So for those unfamiliar with what a significant data gap is, it's where you're performing your phase 1, and for some reason you weren't able to get certain information. Let's say you're doing a site inspection and you didn't have access to a particular room in the building. So that's a data gap. You asked for historical resources, or you tried to find them, you couldn't find them. That may be a data gap. So the consultant needs, the EP needs to determine, okay, well, I've got a data gap, but is it significant, right? But what is significant? Well, again, that wasn't defined in the 2013 standard, and now it is. And ostensibly, in the text is in front of you, but ostensibly what it means is, you know, if you thought that it's likely, if you had that information, that there could be a recognized environmental condition, then that is going to be a significant data gap. And it's for this reason that if you have significant data gaps, the chances that there could be a wreck at the subject property, it could be more than just a regular data gap. And for that reason, in addition to wrecks and CRECs being listed in the conclusion section, significant data gap should also be listed in the conclusion section. And here we talk about the conclusion section. So we have the report's findings, opinions, and conclusions. These varied across the board. Different people are doing different things. Sometimes they were putting in recommendations, which are not part of the standards, not necessary, unless the EP has been contracted to offer recommendations. And I should clarify what exactly are recommendations. So there's a difference between an EP stating that further investigation would be necessary to determine whether there is a wreck here, right? Let's say you have a significant data gap, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's different from a recommendation saying the user is recommended to put in 5 borings and collect, 10 soil samples and 3 groundwater samples and test it for volatile organic compound, whatever it is. That's a more specific recommendation. That's not part of the phase 1, again, unless contracted to do so by the user. So where do we stand right now? Where is what's the status of the 2021 standard with regards to the EPA? So the EPA published its direct final rule, proposed final rule, providing that the 21 standard could be used to comply with all appropriate inquiries, which is great. This is what they did in 2013 as well. They said, you can use the 2013 standard, and if you if you do the 2013 standard, you have met all appropriate inquiries under circular. So they did come out with this rule, but they also included, and they said you can use the 2021 standard, but they also retained the 2013 standard. So largely because of this, the EPA received several negative comments, and this was recently. It came out in mid-April, and by the middle of May, the EPA rescinded that rule and has withdrawn it so that now they're going to be looking back and looking to see what revisions are necessary in the rule. One would expect the same thing that happened in 2013, which is in 2013 they included both the 2005 and the 2013, and then eventually they took out the 2005 standard. One would expect that the same thing will happen here, that right now they included both the 2021 and 2013 standard, and then they're eventually going to get rid of the 2013 standard. So that is the hope and the dream, only because it was sort of confusing when they're saying you can do either the 2021 standard or the 2013 standard, and yet the ASTM task group has clearly said that if you want to meet good customary practice standards and practices, it's the 2021 standard, right? The 2013 standard is by definition now a historical standard. So it makes sense that you can't do the 2013 standard and still adhere to the 2021 standard. But the 2021 standard does include everything that the 2013 standard also includes. So if you do that, you're still covered under 2013. But before I confuse the matters, let's look at exactly what consultants should be doing now. What should we be doing? Should we be preparing phase ones to the 2013 standard, because that is still, according to the EPA, the standard that protects, that offers the AAI? Or should you be using the 2021 standard, even though the EPA has not approved that officially? Or should you be doing both? Or what are the options here? So until the EPA officially recognizes the 2021 standard, ASTM recommends using one of the following strategies. The first thing that you can do is that you can continue using and citing the 2013 standard until the EPA approves the new 21 standard for compliance with AAI regulations. And you'd be fine for doing that. It is protective. It does comply with the AAI regulations. The other thing that you could do is that you could use and cite the new 2021 standard, and there may be some utility for that, especially with regarding a CREC, especially for brownfield. So that may be something that you want to do instead. Or you could cite the 2013 standard and indicate that the Phase I ESA also incorporates procedures as prescribed in the new 2021 standard. Personally, I'm doing the last one. And that's not, for me and for many consultants, it's not really a very heavy lift, because we've already been doing all this stuff in the 2021 standard. So to say that you're doing all of those same things, but still adhering to the 2013 standard sort of makes sense. So people may have questions, and we are very, very happy to answer them now. I know that for some things I skimmed over, and maybe there's more details to share there. So we're happy that here's our contact information. We are available for questions, and that wraps up my part of the presentation.
Thank you, Chemmie. That was great. And thank you, Denise, as well. That was also great. Throughout the webinar so far, we've been assembling questions from our audience, and we're now going to move into our question and answer session moderated by Sue Boyle. And you can continue submitting questions as we move through this discussion. We'll answer as many of the questions as we can through 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So let's get started, Sue, if you want to proceed, and thanks again to everybody.
Thank you, and there are some wonderful questions, and we will get to them. And thank you, Chemmie and Denise, for terrific presentations, and I'm delighted to be here. I laughed at the beginning, at least to myself, about Denise saying how much she loves RCRA. I'm a big New Jersey Spell Act junkie myself, so but I actually mentioned that intentionally, because one of the things that Chemmie, Denise, and I have spoken about is that there are certain states that have their own unique requirements for due diligence especially as it pertains to innocent landowner defenses. So if you're working in New Jersey, for example, you heard that Chemmie has done a lot of PAs, preliminary assessment reports. So it's important, depending on where you're working, especially since so many of you are from outside of Maryland, just know if your state requires something special for that state innocent purchaser defense. And actually, I'd like to start with that innocent landowner defense for a minute, because we've talked about the ins and outs of an ASTM Phase I, but I recently sat through a legal forum, and sometimes we have attorneys as speakers with us, and was just told of two recent cases where the age of the document, so that shelf life that Chemmie spoke about, as well as the certifications, were deemed insufficient, and the innocent purchaser defense was lost. So if Chemmie or Denise or both of you would like to opine on the importance of the innocent purchaser defense as it relates to a good Phase I. I mean, I think that's why so many people on this webinar are interested in this for their clients. Do you have any advice on that, about why that's so important to make sure your Phase Is are done properly to retain that defense?
Sure. Well, I guess I can start, and Denise, you can chime in. I'll dumb this down. It's basically about buying a lemon. That's really it's what it comes down to. Is when you buy a property and it's impacted, you own that impact. You own the remediation that's necessary. I've got some great horror stories I could share. You don't want to be the person who is buying the property as an investment. You don't do decent due diligence. And then it turns out that either when you're developing a property or when you're trying to sell the property, it turns out that it's contaminated, and now you have that headache. It's your responsibility. So what due diligence does is it basically is looking before you leap. That's what it is. It's what am I getting into, or what could I be getting into before I necessarily have to get into it? And it may be that you think there's only $10,000 of remediation necessary, and there's $100,000 or $1 million of remediation that's necessary. You want to know that before you ink the deal, and that's really the purpose of all appropriate inquiries. One of the main reasons.
I agree. Denise?
So I would agree wholeheartedly that the reason we would recommend you do that Phase I is to identify those potential liabilities. And it happens even today. I mean, we have a scenario of a dry cleaner that someone purchased at an auction, I think about 1.5 years ago, with no prior due diligence. And I'm just going to say that.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say that, and whether you do it beforehand, it typically will come back up, particularly as we see state requirements changing over time as well, that we'll find it eventually, and it's much easier to deal with it proactively than reactively.
Great. Well, let me get to some of the great questions from the audience. A number of questions about, could you recap property use limitation changes? So does this mean a CREC could just be from, say, zoning of commercial use with no formal restriction disallowing residential use? I see Chemmie shaking his head, so he knows the answer.
Yeah. So I purposely and intentionally skimmed over this and didn't go into great detail because I knew it was going to come up in the questions, and I wanted to allow enough time for questions and answers at the end. Basically yes. Now I would highly encourage the people to look at not only the definition of the CREC in the new standard, but there's also a discussion in the new standard. But basically, yeah, so when you have I'll give you an example. You have a site, let's say it's being remediated in New Jersey, and it's being overseen by a licensed remediation professional, and the site's being remediated, and you remediate it to commercial standards, and it's zone commercial, so it's remediated commercial standards. Now, those standards have been predefined by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. It's not just that they're arbitrary standards, that there is a set list that you need to meet. If it meets the commercial standards, then it's been remediated. Now, does that mean that you do need a cap, you don't need a cap, administrative controls, that type of thing? It may or may not need that, but the notion that you need a legal instrument to be a CREC is not correct. Now, again, there's probably some attorneys out there who are like, oh my goodness, and if I told you the number of arguments that were, I'm going to call them discussions in the task group that we were talking about this, it's a big deal. It's definitely, especially for brownfield development, it's important to know that there's a legal, there's this new definition out there, and you can. But again, I just want to clarify that it's a CREC, but a CREC is a REC. So, whether it's a REC or a CREC, it's still a REC. And a CREC is just a distinction that ASTM basically made up that allows a clarification between a REC, which is absolutely, it's not being controlled at all, versus a REC, which is under some sort of control. And that control could be to a commercial standard, which has been preset, for example, by the state.
Denise, anything to add?
No, I mean, I can give a real life example that also happened recently where commercial building with an underground storage tank, it was removed while the building was commercial. And then it was, and this is all within the last 5 years. I'm not going to shock you when I'm going to say it was then renovated to residential apartments. And then a phase one was done for refinancing, and that historic, and it has closure with the regulatory agency. And that turned a CREC into a REC. I mean, a CREC is a REC, but now a REC that has a recommendation.
This question is of interest to me because I do not know the answer to it. Do archaeological studies fall within the requirements of the ASTM 21 standard?
No.
For example, indigenous people's use of a site. And you're both
No.
saying no. Okay.
Very interesting, but no.
There are two questions about recommendation of whether to use the 2021 or the 2013 standard. I thought that Chemmie's presentation was clear on that and discussed the options, but if the people who submitted those questions still want them asked or answered, we can do that. Chemmie, you want to go through it one more time since it came up twice?
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief. Basically, you can do a phase one to the 2021 standard. You could do it to the 2013 standard, or are we going back now? Okay. Or you can do it to the 2013 standard. In other words, the report says this phase one is being prepared to the 2013 standard, but also incorporates procedures as prescribed in the new 2021 standard. So you're doing everything in a way that the 2021 standard prescribes, but you're still meeting a 2013 standard. And again, the reason, the 2 points to reiterate here is, number one, the reason you can do that is that there is nothing in the 2021 standard that is not already required in the 2013 standard. It's just clarified better. That's number one. And number two, the reason why you want to be doing it or referencing the 2013 standards is because currently the EPA has recognized 2013 to meet AAI and has not, until the rule is finalized, recognized 2021. And so that's why there's sort of like this workaround where you're doing a 2013 standard, but also adhering to the 2021 standard. I hope that clarifies things.
If it doesn't, put that in the questions again, please, and we'll get more clarification. And follow up on the archaeological questions. Can't cultural and archaeological considerations be considered a business risk? And an archaeological assessment is required if there is a federal nexus on the site, but it is separate. So I don't know if that changes your answers. You were both so firm in your no.
So I actually was speaking to Denise about this, I think only just a couple of days ago, and I'll reiterate the point here. I'm actually glad that the question has been elaborated upon a little bit. So business environmental risk. So I want to be clear about when an EP is looking for conditions at their site. There are 4 buckets. And 4 buckets only: REX, HREX, CREX, de minimis conditions. Now, you can have a significant data gap, but the 4 buckets that you have to figure out whether something falls into, those are the 4. Now, business environmental risk is not one of those 4. Business environmental risk is something which is very nice and can certainly be looked at if contracted by the client, by the user, but it's not part of a phase 1. What some consultants do is they can't figure out whether something is a REC or CREC or what have you, so they just dump it into this BER bucket as if that's like a capsule. Well, I couldn't figure out whether something is a REC or not, so I'm just going to flag it in the report as a BER. That is not appropriate. That is not how BER should be used. So coming, to reiterate, both Denise and I are shaking our heads. No, archaeology is not part of a phase 1. If a user specifically wants that to be part of the phase 1, absolutely, you can contract your consultant to look at that. It is a non-scope item, and it can be looked at as a BER, but it's not automatically the default. It's not included under the phase 1 ordinarily.
Now, that being said, because Chemmie and I also had this discussion, things will often come up when you're doing a phase 1 that would be a concern of our clients. And we feel, I like to provide that information to the client, but not in the phase 1. If it's not supposed to be part of the content of the phase 1, then it's not in there. But that doesn't mean that we hold on to that information and we don't disclose it. I want to be the best consultant I can. So if I'm given information, I'm going to pass that along and say, hey, I think you might want to chase this down. It could be a more significant issue.
Yeah, that's a good point, Denise. And I think it's a distinction that should be made. That if a consultant is being retained to perform a task, that is the task that they should perform. They shouldn't be doing other tasks just because I'll do that anyways. I'm just going to throw in asbestos. I'm just going to throw in radon just because I feel, it's something that I can do. When you're doing something that you're not contracted to do, you're opening yourself up to liability. So a consultant really needs to know what they're being paid to do and what the scope is. However, as Denise said, if they do see something which is a red flag, it's good practice to mention it to the client, but not necessarily to put it in the body of the phase 1 report if they have not been contracted to do so.
Okay. Is there a requirement when including the well search info to look for oil and gas wells in areas where the industry exists? This is asked for, by somebody, I believe, who does work in Colorado. And this will not show up as a normal well search in Colorado, and the questioner finds it to be inconsistent when performing phase 1s, and it might also apply outside of Colorado. And then as a follow-up, the questioner supposes that of concern because commercial uses in zoning could allow, for example, of a daycare within that area. So anything about well searches where in adjacent properties where the industry exists?
So there is a table in the phase 1 standards. It has been there, and it has been revised slightly in the 2021 standard, and it exists in the 2013 standard in the databases that are required and the radii that one looks at. So definitely that is something that should be done, and there is some discretion by the EP if they change that. But that's not to say that there is no need to look at other databases if in those areas such databases are likely to contain information that could indicate the potential presence of a wreck at the subject property. So if in Colorado, as the example was provided, if it's common that these wells are there, the database is there, and these wells may indicate the presence of a wreck at the subject property, then yeah, I would say you should be looking at that. It may not be required under the Phase I per se, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't be looking at it under those states. And every state, every location is going to be different. So certainly in places like New Jersey and Massachusetts and other states where we have LSRPs and we have different acts like the Spill Act, I think, Sue, you referred to that, and ISRA and other stuff like that. Every state, every location is going to be different, which is why it's important to retain consultants who really understand those specific areas, what the typical concerns are, and know, what to look for and how to handle that.
Yeah, and I can't emphasize that enough. As somebody whose practice is predominantly New Jersey, I've seen a lot of Phase I's and the New Jersey PAs done by people who don't understand New Jersey law and regulation, and it shows, and it's problematic for maintaining that landowner defense, innocent landowner defense. So it's really important to know the state that you're working in, which doesn't mean you can't learn other states. You don't have to live there, but you should be familiar with it. Are there definitions?
Oh,
or
wait,
Go ahead.
I add too? Well, no, and so the reason I'm going to add this is, so the database service providers, they provide us with a wealth of information beyond the ASTM databases. And one of the things that we like to do is, obviously, the ASTM tells you what databases you should be looking for, but use those other databases as a resource for finding wrecks on your subject property. And that's exactly what Chemmie said, but I just wanted to clarify that you're going to get that information, use it. If you've been given the information, there's probably a reason why, and at least one case of you could find something with it.
Okay.
So we do that. I always look at all of the databases for the subject property and the adjoining properties, and then are focused on what the ASTM requires. And it's all about looking for those wrecks.
So from what I'm hearing from the two of you, you may be doing $2,000 Phase I's, but you're spending way more than $2,000 worth of time. Yes.
I don't do $2,000 Phase I's, I'll tell you that.
So it's
this industry, like many other industries, you get what you pay for, and buyer beware, caveat emptor. So it's you get what you pay for.
So the $2,000 Phase I was the ones that I was doing in 1994. I'm not saying that they can be widely ranging at this point, and if it's a nonprofit, it could be in that direction. But I agree, you do get what you pay for.
And I can't emphasize that enough to folks who are on this webinar. It is, we often get asked to turn them around in 3 days at the lowest possible bid. I don't know how that's doing anybody any good, but I digress.
And the other thing I will say, because I do say this to my folks as well, is that all of those historic records, the regulatory records, the site visit, people miss things. We do. It just happens. And every single layer of additional information is the ability to find something that if you didn't see it in the site visit in the historic records. I mean, there are times where I will do 2 or 3 site visits because I might pick something up and say, I need to double check that.
Okay.
Which is why skimming on them is not good.
Yeah. It's 2:29. We've been asked if we would stay on for 10 more minutes, and I do have a question that from the attendees I'd like to ask you if you have 10 more minutes.
It's fine for me.
Okay. So are there definitions of best practices for adjoining and surrounding area, quote, adjoining, quote, surrounding area? thinking of a situation where a Phase I site may be impacted by upstream groundwater contamination or another wreck. So are those adjoining and surrounding defined?
Adjoining is defined. It was defined in the 2013 standard, and it's still defined in the 2021 standard as a contiguous property, if not for a road or a thoroughfare or something like that. So that definition is in there. Surrounding properties are not defined in either the 2013 standard or the 2021 standard. That was intentional. We did bandy around the idea of defining of having a surrounding property definition, but for various reasons we decided not, because for various reasons, but one of the reasons was because it's somewhat up to the discretion of the EP as to what defines surrounding, and it's so site specific. But adjoining properties is defined, and the requirements for both adjoining and surrounding are now in the 2021 standard, and it's pretty clear what one needs to do in there.
Well, this might be an interesting observation and question to go out on. So we have a question about somebody who performed a Phase I for a property that included a small family graveyard. The property was being sold to the county for the installation of potable wells. They considered it, the person who did the Phase I considered it a wreck due to the materials used in preparing the deceased back then, and the supervisor said it was not a wreck. Do you have any opinions on that?
Yeah, formaldehyde, I think, is the chemical that they're probably referring to. I'd be surprised if that was going to be, for graveyards, like for big graveyards, which from your description, it didn't seem, you said it was a family graveyard. So maybe, I don't know how many bodies that would be, but, and if they were prepared with large amounts of formaldehyde. So my guess is that we're probably not talking about a lot here, which maybe means that it's a de minimis condition if it's there at all. However, I have had sites next to a graveyard, and there was formaldehyde in the groundwater. I think it was in the ground soil. I forget where it was, but I have seen it. Obviously, it's rare. That's probably what he or she is referring to.
And I confused matters before, so let me go back to this add-on. The person who, give me 1 second. We had spoken about the zoning, and so as a follow-on, the person who had asked about commercial uses was concerned about daycare facilities with different receptors than commercial and how it would be protective. So I think the original question had to do with, I'm trying to find it here. Here it is. Recapping property use limitations, particularly as it has to do with zoning and commercial uses that don't allow residential use but might allow a daycare center.
I think this is going to be probably location specific. So the reason I mention that is because in New Jersey, the state that I'm probably most familiar with in any other state, they have specific standards and regulations for daycares, for sensitive populations, hospitals, residences, that type of thing, schools. And so I guess I'll answer the question sort of in a more general sense, not to make it specific to New Jersey, is that if the regulatory authority allows that use, then they allow that use. And so it's not, you know, it's control, but if they don't allow the use, then they don't. So it really depends on what's allowed, right? If it's allowed, then it's allowed. If you know what I'm saying, is that I don't know if, does that answer the question?
So, and I'm going to say, if this is from someone in Maryland, if you're in Maryland, our cleanup standards, when we look at land uses under the Maryland Voluntary Cleanup Program, one of the land uses is a high frequency use recreational use, which is specifically targeting, I shouldn't say targeting, but specific to daycares, schools, that would be in a commercial, so that if you had a cleanup occur to a non-residential criteria, let's say a retail strip mall, you might get closure under our state program. If you then put in one of those retail units, a daycare, it would then contradict that land use that was allowable under the environmental cleanup standard. I don't know if that answers their question, but there are areas where your zoning could contradict your cleanup. And as the environmental professional local to your area, it's important that you understand where that could occur. So you're not saying, you're not doing a phase one and saying, no, you're good, when in fact, a non-residential cleanup standard or a non-residential cleanup may not allow a use that's existing at a property, that you'd have a contradiction.
That's a good point, Denise, and I guess I'll just put a cherry on top of that, and that is that the new CREC definition includes the words "in future use." So not only is the EP meant to be looking at what is currently there, but is also what the future use of the property is. And it's always a question that I ask my clients is, I'm doing a phase one which looks at the current use and the historical use, true. But the EP should also ask, what are your future uses? If it's commercial now, but you know that it's going to be used, for example, for a daycare, and you know that it's cleaned up to the commercial standards that wouldn't allow a daycare, but it's going to be a daycare, well, you're going to be handling that differently in the report to if you think it's going to be a warehouse and the plan is going to be a winner. You may not know what's going to happen way in the future, but at least today, for the current user, you should be able to look at that. So it's definitely a question that needs to be asked and considered.
Yeah, it can shape your conclusions.
Great advice. Let me do one last question. Topographical records were mentioned as a source of information. Would subsidence of the property due to withdrawal of groundwater be a condition to include within the report?
I would say likely not, because a structural engineering review is not part of a phase one. However, to Denise's point that she very clearly said, earlier, if a consultant's walking by and they're seeing cracks, they may want to be saying something to the client like, hey, you may want to have a look at that and get a structural assessment done, but it's not part of the structural assessment, it's not part of the phase one.
Yeah. I'm actually going to caveat that slightly. It's not. However, we have a lot of requirements where there are caps on properties for annual inspections, operations, and maintenance. If you have something that's going to structurally affect a cap, that could then pull it back into a phase one, because that would affect the controlled recognized environmental condition.
Right. If it's going to be a material threat of a release.
Yeah.
So that's the third part of the REP definition, and yes, I would agree with you on that. But I should probably just sort of play devil's advocate for that, and that is that the EP should be careful that you don't necessarily have to, like, if you're looking at a cap, and as was the case with one of my sites, that there were literally trees growing through the cap, I would say that's an issue. This cap is not protective of public health and the environment. But to go to the nth degree to ascertain whether this cap is actually being protected, that's not part of the requirement. So there is like a little bit of a gray area there that you have to use some discretion there to figure out what's necessary and what's not, or under the phase one.
Just so you know, Denise, big shout out to you that you did get that daycare question, and the zoning was exactly what the person was asking about. So I'm guessing they are. Vicki, I'm guessing you are a Maryland person.
I'm glad I could help.
And a big shout out to both of you in the questions for excellent presentations. So with that, am I turning it back to Sylvia and Jason?
Yes, thank you, Sue. Thank you all so much for that excellent discussion. We just wanted to give you each an opportunity for a final thought if you had anything that you wanted to end on, and we would start with Sue and then Chemmie and then Denise. So we'll go in reverse order.
I just would like you, to remember that the importance of these documents for that innocent landowner defense, either at a state level or a federal level. And I think a good Phase I, or in New Jersey, a good PA is one of the best environmental values you can get to help you with future decisions of a project, but they need to be done properly.
Yeah, I think I'm going to mirror what Sue just said. I think, you know, they are legal documents that you know, can be used for legal purposes, and they're important, and you do get what you pay for, like in most industries. So I guess what I would say is we've spoken a lot of details over the last hour and a half, hour and 3/4. There is more details to say. We skimmed where, because, you know, there's a lot to cover. I teach a whole one-day class on due diligence, and that there's a lot of details. And so my advice would be that users should trust their consultants, that don't just give it to your consultant and hope to get, you know, spend the least amount of money and do it as a checkbox. It's as Sue said, it's a tool. It's very, very valuable. And use a consultant that you trust, that is your advocate, that understands not only the nature of a Phase I, but why are you doing what you're doing? What are your plans? And to really understand what, you know, the past, the present, and the future as far as you and the Phase I is concerned. So that's what I would say is, you know, really trust who you use, and ask questions and push back. You need to understand stuff as well. So if your consultant isn't a good teacher, get someone else.
I don't really think there's much I can add to that, although, Chemmie, if you don't, I mean, we prefer our clients not push back. I'm teasing on that one. Only that it would make my job a little, it would be the same. But yes, no, I agree with all of that, the quality of the Phase I, there's a reason it takes time, and there's a reason it can be expensive at times. And it's more expensive if you don't do it properly.
Thank you all so much. So this is Sylvia Mosser with the Maryland Department of Planning to conclude our webinar, the new ASTM Phase I standard, the nuts and bolts. I would like to offer a very large thank you to Denise and Chemmie for a great presentation, to Sue for her skilled moderating, to everyone who attended today, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology expert, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on the Maryland Department of Planning's website. Also, for those who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you will be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. Keep an eye on your email inbox for details on the next webinar in this series, Revitalization and Redevelopment, Advancing Local Projects Through Tools and Programs, at 1 p.m. Eastern, June 22nd. Have a great day.